The battle in the Mammon Valley is over.
The war is not.
And for Winston Churchill, a young man in a hurry, a new challenge is looming.
Because Churchill isn't just fighting this war, he wants to explain it.
This is episode 3, Aftermath and Argument.
Here on Churchill, the finest half hour. Welcome to Churchill, the finest half hour. I'm Dr. Warren Dockter, and with me is my own roving commission partner, Professor Richard Toye.
How are you, Warren?
I'm doing well, and I'm excited to discuss Churchill and his views on the great game and the Ford policy today.
And do a bit of roving. Probably
Obviously.
Worth mentioning for listeners that his book, My Early Life, published in 1930, was subtitled A Roving Commission. In England, anyway. Was it even called A Roving Commission, full stop, in the USA? I can't quite remember.
I don't think it was. I think it was just called My Early Life, and then there was no subtitle. I could be mistaken, and I would love for a listener to write in and tell me I'm wrong.
Yeah, they can Google it for us. So last time, Churchill had been in this big battle in the Mammon Valley. Certainly a high point of this campaign in the Malakand Field Force in terms of his writing, but the fighting was far from over at this stage.
That's right, Richard. Basically, there's no conclusion, which I think gives him a moment to reflect on the larger nature of the whole reason they're there and the impending feeling of like, well, what's going to happen next?
Exactly. I mean, because I think we could well say that this battle is one of those things where the one side has got overwhelming firepower, or so it thinks. We've got the technology. These people are pretty primitive. We're going to go in, teach them a good lesson, and they're going to run away and give up. And that isn't really what happens.
Oh, not at all. If anything, nothing gets resolved. I mean, it's impossible for me as an American to look at this and not think of the Vietnam War. But you have a really substantially larger and more technologically powerful military force fighting against a relatively primitive military force, but nothing's changing.
Yeah, and there's actually a one of the letters which Churchill sends back to the Daily Telegraph kind of describes this really odd encounter or episode, I might say, where at night the British forces, including, of course, Indian soldiers, there's a hill which is overlooking them, which is a great place for the tribesmen to shoot at them. And it's like, well, we could move to this other place, but then there's another hill over there as well. So we've got to stay put. And so basically, overnight, this sniping continues. The men who have been wounded are very frightened by it, but that gives you a sense of this from the British point of view. But even though it's not doing us a huge amount of damage, we haven't conclusively achieved a victory.
Well, no, what I find really interesting in here is that you have a classic asymmetric situation with a very powerful force and then a local group on the ground who know the terrain better and who've adopted using this asymmetric strategy, which classical military tactics would call a Fabian strategy, coming from a Fabius Maximus in your classical military history, which is basically a strategy whereby you realize that you cannot destroy your enemy up front in a full engagement, so you harass them over time to break their morale and to break their will to fight or will to be there. And in particular, one of the most effective tools of a Fabian strategy is sniping, because it creates an omnipresent feeling of fear that at any moment you may get shot. And you can imagine the psychological strain that this put on the British troops there in India, that at any moment they might get shot. It creates a panopticon of fear.
Yeah, I mean, Churchill himself is maybe far less bothered by that than a lot of other people, and even possibly enjoys it, although he does mention quite a lot of killed and wounded soldiers nonetheless. But that could well be Churchill's specific personality, or he could be bigging up the courage of the British soldiers.
Well, see, that's how I read it, Richard. If you read the dispatches, and this is less in his book, The Malakand Field War, but more in the actual dispatches, to me, it feels like he's trying to assure the readers that he himself, of course, isn't scared. He's a British man. He's not afraid of anything. He's happy to be there in a way that almost indicates that he is actually terrified and that he's trying to cover it up. I mean, that's maybe just me reading into it.
Well, I mean, I suppose that if he was that terrified of bullets, I would say he probably wouldn't have gone to great efforts to get into the next couple of wars that he
True.
tried to
That's
do.
a valid point. Valid
You
point.
know, so I suppose it's more like I think that maybe he was insensitive to what other people might have been feeling
But that's very
because
classically Churchillian, I should say.
I would say so, and that he is somebody who wants to live life as an adventure and maybe doesn't totally understand other people who want things a bit more comfortable and normal.
Yeah, no, and speaking of non-normal things, there were a lot of animals
Yeah.
on these expeditions, which we don't really think about when we think about this stuff. Think of the terrain of Pakistan and Afghanistan in this region. They're having to move enormous amounts of logistical, infrastructural things up mountains with mules, with camels, with donkeys, with horses, mostly men with horses. And you could just imagine that not only are these things moving slowly, inching their way up the hill, but at the same time, for the snipers we were just talking about, they make pretty easy cannon fodder to advance. So the animals, particularly the mules, I think, took a lot of fire and would frequently just fall on the side of the road.
Yes, and he is actually quite interesting on this. I mean, that Churchill isn't only describing battles; he does want to describe the logistics. I mean, there's obviously a logical reason for this, that he's being paid £5 a letter, and that when there isn't a battle, he's going to say, "Well, I'm going to write about something else to make sure I get my £5, right?" But he does also bring home to the reader some of the realities and the difficulties of moving about and the vast logistical effort which is involved. Some people find the writing a bit over the top. But I think as a writer, he was consistently trying to come up with things that he thought his readers would find interesting, even if there wasn't anything very dramatic going on that day.
Yeah, I completely agree. And he
Yeah.
applies that color to the fact that there is basically an industrial supply chain of animals moving things in, even when there's not much else going on. So you can compare that to the heroic battle scenes where he talks about taking fire from opponents and things from the hillside, but at the same time, after even if it is incidental or accidental, it does capture it in a way that I don't think other writers with the British troops do capture.
And also, I mean, he does spend a lot of time talking about policy. I mean, that's one of the things which he wants to advocate, I would argue, this so-called forward policy of British expansion. And so his letter, which he sends from Shumshuk on 21st of September, 1897, is all about that. And he's talking about, I mean, this is really your territory because he's talking about Islam or Mohammedanism as he calls it. And he's saying really that there's been this strenuous effort by the mullahs to foment a general rising of the tribes against the British. And he says, well, what's the reason for this? And what he says is, this is his very imperialist argument, his contact with civilization destroys the superstition and credulity on which the wealth and the influence of the mullah depend. So what he's saying there is that these guys wouldn't be in a position of power if people realize how civilization works, or it gets all its benefits, if people would naturally, of course, he thinks, follow the British way of life if only they were sufficiently exposed to it. And so
Right.
the mullahs work people up into this religious frenzy. Fanaticism is a word which he uses because they are trying to secure their own power. And he talks about where there's been secret encouragement from the south, from India itself, and assistance has been given from Kabul. But he says, well, the Anglo-Indian army it's got such a great reputation that all the efforts of these ordinary mullahs failed. But there was this special so-called great labeling Victorian meme, the Mad Mullah.
Right. Yeah.
um, this guy comes forward and so succeeds in again stirring up the people. The extraordinary credulity of the people is hardly conceivable. So for him, it's hardly conceivable that when the British start coming and shooting at people, that they might take a somewhat different view. It has to be religious fanaticism that explains all this.
Right. I mean, there's a couple of things I think I agree with you, but there's a couple of things I want to throw at that. And one is, I think Churchill in some ways distinguishes these mullahs as being a part of a fanatical type of Islam or fanatical type of Mohammedanism, as he would have called it, whereas many of people he's fighting on the same side with are more traditional types of Islam. So he does distinguish them in this cultural hierarchy. I do think, based on these writings, of course, other writings later on, that Churchill sees Islam as an Abrahamic religion, but as a religion that is more likely to be taken in by these mad mullahs, this type of demagoguery, in a way that Christianity wouldn't. But that is to say, he still understood that there was an orthodox, normal version of Islam, which at this time he sees as being emanating through the Ottoman Empire. And he even talks about, he globalizes this as about the victory of the Turks over the Greeks. He mentions that in the same thing. But one of the other elements I want to introduce here is that other elements that he thinks have whipped the tribes into a frenzy besides Islam, he's not totally blaming Islam, is what he calls the intrigues of Russia has aided to the intense hostility among the tribesmen. And that these intrigues had been, I'm reading it, the intrigues of Russia had for some times been watched with alarm by the Indian government. And so I'll keep reading it. As long as the border could remain a no man's land, a great gulf fixed, all was well. But if any power was to be supreme there, that power could not be Russia. The predominance of Russian influence in these territories would give them the power to invade India at their discretion, with what chances of success need not be here discussed. A change of policy became inevitable. So I think Churchill sees this Islamic fervor as being a tool manipulated by the Russian Empire to some extent.
Absolutely. And I mean, going back to what you said about Islam, I mean, I think, as your own work shows, Churchill in the Islamic World, which people should rush out and buy
Immediately.
As soon as the podcast is finished, not before. What's really important is that people often quote some of Churchill's hostile comments about Islam, particularly from the 1890s, and then say, well, that was his view of Islam, whereas you show that it evolved over time, and that basically these quotes shouldn't be used for the very superficial purposes of saying Islam is horrible, and here is a quote from Winston Churchill that proves it, as people often actually do online, and sometimes send me emails saying that.
No, I do too. And I mean, in fact, that particular quote you're talking about comes from an edition of The River War, which is a story of Churchill during the Anglo-Sudanese War. And in it, the full quote very clearly illustrates my opinion that he's talking about a very specific sect of Islam, the Dervish Islam, that was found in Sudan. Again, Churchill, who was already describing the British Empire as a Muslim empire, clearly knew that millions of Muslims served in the British Army in India. He's serving with them now in the Malacan Field Force. So this gets taken wildly out of context. And what I find really interesting is it started being taken out of context as a justification for the Iraq War. And this became very popular among neocons, Paul Wolfowitz being one of them, and popularized by various people who were very pro the Iraqi war, to try to paint Churchill as somehow retrospectively agreeing with that position. I don't know if he would have agreed. I'm not making that comment, but I'm saying that that's not what Churchill's quote does. Churchill's speaking about very specific brands of Islam, and I think people do miscategorize it, unfortunately. And again, it was an evolving thing.
Yes, and he's in this phase of the campaign where it is winding down. So on 8th of October, he's saying, we've entered upon a period of comparative peace. The moment have expressed a wish to sue for terms, and there are negotiations. 14th of October, when in my last letter I wrote that a convoy was starting for the base, I did not anticipate that I should accompany it myself. And so there he is. This is the end of his involvement in this episode of frontier war, as he calls it. He goes on to describe the sort of the transport of the sick and wounded and so on. So even though the story is winding down, he's still making the most of it. And although his involvement in this fighting is at an end, the next stage is going to be for him to write this up into a book in order to further impress his personality on the British public. And we'll come back to that not entirely straightforward process after the break. Welcome back to Churchill, the Finest Half Hour, with me, Richard Toye, and my fellow rover, Dr. Warren Dockter. And so, Warren, his experience with the first phase of the Malacan Field Force is an end, and Churchill, he recalls in his book, My Early Life, I now had good hopes of being permanently attached to the Malacan Field Force and of roaming around these valleys for some time. And he says, that the tale of the Battle of 16th of September, this big battle between the British and the tribesmen, had been spread far and wide. And so I think what Churchill's really hoping for here is that things are really going to kick off and that he's going to be able to make this as permanent deal of writing and fighting at the same time.
Which, of course, he does keep doing that, but not maybe how he imagined that he would, because this particular element of his adventure winds down to a close. He's writing about the political things, but he has to go on what's called the Tara Field Force. Am I pronouncing that right? I don't know. But basically, it creates a kind of an escalation for Churchill, because it creates an escalation from a more localized campaign into a larger, grander imperial expedition.
Yeah. And I mean, basically, if Churchill is expected by his colleagues that he's going to go back to normal and go back to Bangalore, where he was previously stationed. And he says, my brother officers, when I returned to them, were extremely civil, but I found a very general opinion that I had had enough leave and should now do a steady spell of routine duty. But he wants to really attach himself to some other battle. And he says, I watched with wistful eyes the newspaper accounts of the Tirah campaign. So there's another rebellion which the British are going to put down. And he's like, I want to go there.
I love that he says he watched wistfully.
Yeah. I mean, I think it clearly was a thrill for him. And I think that he suffered from boredom. He didn't like sitting around. I mean, he did read a lot, but really he wanted to be in the action.
Right, and he ultimately wasn't able to go on the action. He finished up the Malacan, and in his dispatches, he has two where he starts questioning the wisdom of the frontier policy itself, which of course got him into trouble for questioning those kinds of larger strategic issues. And then ultimately, he was unable really to go on the Tirah expedition. If you look at My Early Life, it's a wonderful thing. He says, very Churchillian, I did not cry myself to sleep about the misadventures of the Tirah expedition. After all, they had been very selfish in not letting me come with them.
He does actually have he almost is successful, because there's a character called Aymer Haldane who will encounter if we should ever do a series, as I think we might, on the South African War.
Oh, yes.
And he presses his case with Haldane. He was very impressed with him. And partly it's the fact that the Tirah campaign goes very badly, and basically the campaign comes to an end before Churchill can potentially successfully get himself attached to it. I think if it had gone on longer, then he might have managed to pull it off.
Yeah, I think so too, and particularly through his relationship with Aymer Haldane, who, like you say, they were pretty good friends for a time, and then I think fell out after the Boer War. But one of the most interesting things for me is later on, when Churchill is putting together the Middle East Department, Aymer Haldane finds himself working with Churchill because he's in Iraq when he is later a general. So it's all connected. It's all connected. But so Churchill also, I think, like you say, he wants to be in the action. He can't be in the action. He's trying to get in the action. While he's doing this to busy himself, he's turning his dispatches into a larger book on the Malacan Field Force, which he calls The Story of the Malacan Field Force.
Right. I mean, not much of the manuscript has survived, but a few pages do survive in the Churchill papers. And they are handwritten. But what he doesn't do, he doesn't just take the option of saying, well, I've already written these dispatches, so I'll just copy them out again, maybe write a couple of linking passages and say it's a book.
No, he didn't. He didn't just cut and paste it. I mean, that's what you're saying. He actually took his time working it up into a book.
Yes, exactly. His mother, of course, is a great contact for him. He sends the manuscript home to her. Think a little bit about the anxiety that might be involved in posting a manuscript all the way from India to Britain in the days before photocopiers, bearing in mind that a couple of decades later, Lawrence of Arabia forgot the entire manuscript of the Seven Pillars of Wisdom in a taxi, and it vanished forever, and he had to write it again. So this was your fingers crossed that it's really going to make it, but it does make it.
Yes, no, and it's not as straightforward as his mom just putting it in. I mean, she does. She helps him. She uses her contacts in the printing world, but he's also in a deadly race. Deadly's exaggerating it. He's in a race with Finecastle.
Right. So this Viscount Fincastle is someone who, like Churchill, was serving in the army, but was also writing dispatches for the papers, in his case, for the Times.
His book, I don't think is anywhere near as interesting as Winston's. And I mean, I'm not just saying retroactive or retrospectively because Winston Churchill became the Winston Churchill. But if you put the two books, knowing nothing about either men beside each other, Churchill's is a far better book.
Yes. I mean, which isn't to say that Fincastle's is terrible, but it is just this happened, this happened, this happened without any reflection. And I mean, I would say also, again, that Churchill's book is intended as a political intervention, arguing for the forward policy in a disguised way, whilst saying, of course, I'm not going to intervene in any political controversies here. And in a way, that is one of the things which makes it so interesting.
Yeah, and I think that he manages to get caught doing the thing that T.E. Lawrence did do. There's that saying that T.E. Lawrence could famously back up into the spotlight. And I think Churchill was trying to back up into the spotlight, but I also think that he got busted a little bit, in particular from the military, who didn't like this young subaltern making judgment calls on vast strategic operations and ways to see things. And this did not sit well with everybody, including Horatio Herbert Kitchener. Horatio Kitchener.
Who, of course, was the commander of British forces in Egypt.
And this would become a real serious problem later on in Churchill's military career. And again, he would have to call on his mother to help bail him out. But there were even early letters in disguised against Churchill in the military magazine, where it was like, well, young subaltern shouldn't be telling generals what to do and this stuff. And it would always be signed by someone anonymously.
But even before we get to that stage, Churchill, being Churchill, thinks, all right, I finished one book, I will churn out another one, and writes a novel. Bearing in mind, there's also an American novelist at this time called Winston Churchill. So there's always the possibility of getting confused in the secondhand bookshop and thinking that
you found a mysterious unknown Churchill. No, and in fact, one of my very first papers was about Winston Churchill and Winston Churchill because they shared a correspondence. And that's why Winston Churchill, our Winston Churchill, decided to adopt the S in his signature, was to differentiate himself from Winston Churchill, the American novelist, who, by the way, is not a very good writer, in my opinion. But Winston S. Churchill, again, was a pretty good writer. And I do think it's remarkable. I mean, I don't know how much time we've got to go into his novel, and points at home, ladies and gentlemen, if you know the book's title, I'll give you a moment because I do know it, and I know Richard knows it, Savonarola, which is a really interesting novel for lots of reasons. One of them is about political rhetoric and its use. One of the things I've always found very interesting in it is that there's a political coup in the Mediterranean, which is something Churchill becomes mildly obsessed with.
Yeah, and it's not great, I have to say. Churchill does manage to sell it. It's published in Macmillan's magazine, serialized, as of course was normal in those days, as well as being published in volume 4. It made him over several years £700.
That's not nothing.
Not nothing in those days, but there is a line in my early life where he says, I have consistently urged my friends to abstain from reading it. So he was, in my opinion, I think, in the end. But to go back to the Malakand Field Force, there is something which he finds, I think, very mortifying and embarrassing, which is that he doesn't correct the proofs himself because he doesn't want to have to wait 2 months for the proofs to arrive and then be sent back. Go back and forth from India. He's like, okay, I will let my uncle, a guy called Morton Fruin, who's sort of literary man, he could do it. But unfortunately, Morton Fruin was not a good proofreader, whatever his other qualities. And it's the text as it is published in the first edition is riddled with these shocking misprints and bad punctuation. And so when the book does come out, the reviewers were very often praising the substance, but saying, what about all these blinking typos? And silly mistakes. So Churchill, he says, he was filled with pride and pleasure at the compliments and consternated about the blunders.
You can see in the private letter to his mother when he talks about the blunders, you can feel the frustration at this. But I think it shows you something interesting about young Churchill that's perhaps different than the older Churchill. The idea that he understands that speedily putting this out is maybe even more important than it being done perfectly, because that means he gets to attach his name to the campaign. It means that he gets to put himself out there quickly and authoritatively, even though it isn't perfect. It really sort of pushes him in a way that he had not been pushed forward, I think. And you can really see it transforming his status, I suppose.
Yeah. So in November 1897, he turned 23, right? And the book comes out in 1898. Extraordinarily young. He's got a book out there. So he's doing pretty well from that respect. And furthermore, he gets a letter from the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, dated 22nd of April, 1898. My dear Winston, I cannot resist writing a few lines to congratulate you on the success of your book. Everybody is reading it, and I've only heard it spoken of with praise. And of course, Fincastle, his rival, has won the Victoria Cross. Right. So having now seen active service, the Prince of Wales goes on, you will wish to see more and have as great a chance, I am sure, of winning the VC as Fincastle had. So maybe that's a little regret which Churchill had, that he'd been mentioned in dispatches for making himself useful at a crucial moment, but he hadn't won a medal. And so I think that, did it rankle a little, or at least did it inspire him to try and put himself in situations where, as the Prince of Wales said, he might be able to win some gallantry award in the future?
Which, of course, we know that Churchill certainly wanted to. But I do think if we back out, Richard, there's a larger pattern that we can see here. This is what it teaches us about Winston Churchill's character. And that is that when he sees danger, he runs toward it.
Absolutely. But also when he sees a political opportunity, he runs towards it.
Exactly. So you can see this. There's a pattern that begins to emerge that then you can see in his other writings. There's some danger, there's some interesting bother for him to get involved in. He goes in it, gets experiences, he writes about it. He interprets it. He writes a book about it. He owns the topic. And we'll talk about this potentially later, but right now we're talking about the Malacan Field Force. So if you talk about his book on the River War, of the Anglo-Sudanese War, which I've talked about earlier, that's an authoritative history of that war and is one of the better books written on the topic, in my opinion.
That is very true. And clearly he's then developing as a writer. Malacan Field Force is a good book, but it's certainly not as weighty and as documented in the same way that the River War was. But I guess that Churchill does want to have a political career. And in that letter from the Prince of Wales, like reading between the lines, I think there's a message there which I'm not totally sure that Churchill completely received, because he says, well, if Fincastle is intending to leave the army in order to go into Parliament, he says, you, Winston Churchill, have plenty of time before you, and you should certainly stick to the army before adding MP to your name. So the Prince of Wales is actually saying, look, just quitting the army now and going into politics, that's not really going to do you really good. You want to establish a long record of service, maybe pick up some medals, and then think about going into politics later. Well, Churchill obviously doesn't, as we know, quit the army immediately, but it's very much the way in which his mind is tending. He's already made his first political speech at a meeting in Bath by this stage. And so he's getting a steer from a very important person that that's not the thing to do. The question then is, how does he continue to make a name for himself if he's not yet going to go into politics? The frontier gave Churchill experience.
Writing gave it meaning.
And in turning war into narrative,
he began to turn himself into a public figure.
Not just a soldier.
Not just a reporter.
But something new.
A man who could fight a war.
And then explain why it mattered.
Next time,
a bigger stage.
And a bigger war.
And a young man, still very much in a hurry, heads to Africa.
That's next time on Churchill, The Finest Half Hour.